At ease. It's time to talk about the Spanish-American War. Welcome to U.S. history. So the Spanish-American War, the main idea, the thesis statement, if you will, is that this is the first major step toward an empire for America, toward becoming an imperial power, toward becoming a world power. And we're going to talk about how that is created and sustained and shaped by yellow journalism. Pulitzer and Hearst were the two big names in that. Some other big names involved in the Spanish-American War: Teddy Roosevelt. You knew this was coming. And he wasn't president yet. This is kind of how he becomes famous enough to eventually be president. And his quote from around this time period, as he's growing up, as he's looking around the country, he sees we've sort of closed off the West, right? We've finished out Manifest Destiny. And there's this idea that the frontier is closed and now America is changing, and what are we going to become? And for Teddy Roosevelt, his answer lay in a new adventure. We need a new adventure. We need something beyond, to go even further beyond Manifest Destiny. And his quote here tells you exactly how he thinks we should do that. "I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." That's one way to think about it. And Teddy Roosevelt gets his war. The Cuban Rebellion starts in 1895. The people of Cuba rebel against their Spanish masters, and Cuba is literally 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It is right in our backyard. And Spain doesn't just let Cuba go. They send 150,000 troops to put down this rebellion. And they start these things they called reconcentration camps. Remember, this is the 1895. This is not 1943. And a lot of the rebels, a lot of the people they suspected of being rebels, a lot of family members of rebels got put into these reconcentration camps. And the Spanish forces were led by a guy by the name of General Weyler, whose nickname was the Butcher. So, like, you know what kind of a general this guy is. This is one of the victims of those reconcentration camps. So if you were wondering, does it just kind of sound like the concentration camps the Nazis ended up using, or was it closer to that? It was closer to that. So we have a general who is willing to starve out these rebels and their family and anyone suspected of being a rebel. So in the prison camps, we have 200,000 dead Cubans over 2 years. Not killed by gas chambers, not killed by gunfire, killed by disease and starvation. This is the exact model, just about the exact model, Hitler will use during World War II. This is one of the places he gets the idea from. And there are these Cuban exiles that, sort of saw, that escaped Cuba and got to the U.S., and they try to go to Washington, and they try to get the government to help. Jose Marti was their main guy, and the U.S. government's like, nope, we're not helping. We're staying out of this. Monroe Doctrine. We're staying out of it. And you might be thinking, well, hold on, didn't the Monroe Doctrine say that the U.S. would handle things in the Americas, and Cuba is like 90 miles from Florida? That counts as the Americas, surely. U.S. government didn't want any part of Spain. Our Army and our Navy were not where they needed to be to take on Spain, according to most Americans. There were a few Americans who disagreed, and we'll get to them in a moment. So the Cubans, the Cuban guerrillas, the Cuban rebels, the Cuban, people trying to win their freedom, start destroying American property in Cuba, these American sugar plantations. And basically the message is, if you're not going to help us, we are going to break your stuff and take your money. And if there's one thing Americans don't like, it's people breaking our stuff and taking our money. There's a lot of things Americans don't like, but that's definitely one of them, right? And the message was pretty clear. You help us out, we'll stop doing this. So the U.S. government, that's not enough by itself to get the U.S. government involved. A few things start happening. First of all, this concept of yellow journalism. Now, journalism, has never been just the facts, ma'am. That's when journalism is usually very good, is when they are reporting the facts and they are reporting things objectively and letting us know what really happened. They can tell us what people said, but then they need to be able to follow up and say, like, but this is what this is what they said, but this is what they did, right? Like journalists should call out the truth. But these guys, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, had two competing New York newspapers, and they wanted to outsell the other newspaper, and the way they did that was by, I was going to try and like use some word and be like, oh, they played coy, oh, they stretched the truth. Oh, they just lied. They would just print out straight up lies that they knew would be just, I mean, it's clickbait articles, right? It's the same exact thing. It's where that idea came from, right? You publish all kinds of wild, outlandish claims. You sell newspapers. That's what these guys wanted. So they see this rebellion happening in Cuba, and things are already bad enough, right? Like you have 200,000 Cubans dying of disease and starvation in these reconcentration camps. It's already bad enough. So they take the fact that it's already bad enough and they start exaggerating and just printing straight up lies about how bad the Cubans have it and how evil these Spanish soldiers really are. I mean, the Spanish soldiers were not good guys. General Wheeler was not a good guy, but like they took it and made it even bigger. So the famous quote from William Randolph Hearst to one of his photographers, because they would send photographers down to get pictures and of anything they could to print. And the photographers would get down there and they say, well, it's not as bad as like, it's bad, but it's not as bad as you're saying. And Hearst told the photography, you provide me the pictures, I'll get the war going. I'll furnish the war, right? Like, you just take the pictures, I'll handle the rest. I'll get this war to happen. And this, of course, is a political cartoon, and you can tell because it's not funny and everything's labeled. So they literally have giant printing blocks spelling out war. You have Pulitzer, you have Hearst, like literally written on their clothing. Yeah, say, young feller, watch de tome, I'm de tome. You can't buy it. Yeah, so it's just both of them believe that they sort of own this war as sort of a competing thing over who can make more money out of this war. But first, we need to start the war. There's the rebellion's going on. The Cubans are fighting the Spanish, but Hearst and Pulitzer want the U.S. involved, not because they think it's the right thing, not because they think we should help out these poor rebels fight for their freedom, but because they want to sell more newspapers. And the big first sort of push against this neutrality is Delome, who is a Spanish ambassador, and he's sending a letter back to Spain, basically saying, hey, here's what's going on in America. Here's what I have learned in my official capacity as the Spanish ambassador to America, and I think President McKinley is weak. We're good. They're not going to get involved. America's not going to help the Cuban rebels. President McKinley is weak. Now, McKinley had been trying to stay out of the war, but now he gets called out as being weak. And if there's one thing Americans don't like, it's people breaking their stuff and taking their money. But if there's two things Americans don't like, it's people breaking their stuff and taking their money and then calling us weak. So we don't get into the war yet, but more and more Americans are saying we need to get involved. A, to help these Cubans, B, to rescue our sugar plantations, and C, to prove we're not weak. Now, the Philippines are literally on the other side of the map, right? Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Philippines are right next to Japan, right? Like you can see that on this map. The little circled thing of islands there, that's the Philippines. And you can see where Florida is, and like sort of that little yellow area down there near Florida. That's sort of a zoom in on Cuba. So these are on the opposite sides of the map. One's in the Pacific Ocean, one's in the Atlantic Ocean. But they're both controlled by Spain. The Philippines is under Spanish rule, and Cuba is under Spanish rule. And Teddy Roosevelt, who's not the president yet, he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he was kind of put there because he was like making a lot of noise and making a lot of trouble, and sort of the political establishment didn't like him. So they sort of threw him at this job that sounded fancy and like a big deal, but really it was nothing. He had basically no authority, basically no power, and basically no way for him to like turn that into a better career in politics. There wasn't enough there. But he was one of the ones that sent and received orders from the Secretary of the Navy. So the Secretary of the Navy would tell Teddy Roosevelt, order the troops to do this, and he would send out the letters to the Navy. So he just started sending out letters to naval commanders in the Pacific Ocean to say, hey, we're going to war with Spain soon. Find out where the Spanish fleet is in the Pacific. Be ready to attack the Philippines. Get ready to do this. Now, Teddy Roosevelt had zero authority to give any of these orders, but he did anyway, bargaining if he didn't get caught, things would go well. Like if he succeeds at this, he's not going to get in trouble. And lucky for Teddy Roosevelt, a U.S. warship explodes off the coast of Cuba, the USS Maine. February 15th, 1898, a few weeks after the Delome letter. So Americans are kind of mad that Spain called our president weak, and then one of our boats explodes. Now, it probably wasn't the Spanish. Warships back then were prone to explosions. We had boilers, we had very high pressure systems in those boats that if they weren't properly taken care of or just had a bad day, they could explode, they could catch fire. But our friends Hearst and Pulitzer saw this as the perfect opportunity, and they blamed the Maine on Spain. Remember the Maine became the rallying cry, and the U.S. people freaked out. They're smashing our stuff and taking our money. They called our president weak, and now they blew up one of our warships. They didn't actually blow up one of our warships, but all the newspapers said they did, so the American people believed they did. This is one of the paintings that was published in the newspapers at the time, obviously not a photograph, and obviously you can tell that the person doing the painting wanted this to be seen as an act of war. You see the explosion, you see the bodies, you see the red blood in the water. So this is not just the facts, ma'am, right? There is an agenda here. They want a war so they can sell more newspapers. So McKinley, desperate to stay out of a war, he does not think we can take the Spanish military. He says, okay, you, Spain, in order to avoid this war, you have to do the following. Like, we're about to fight you. We're about to throw hands, right? So you need to pay us for the Maine and all the soldiers that were killed. You need to make peace with the Cuban rebels and then give them independence. And Spain, they've got 150,000 of their troops in Cuba already. Like, their military is not that much bigger. It'd be tough for them to go to war with America at the same time as Cuba. So they're like, okay. We'll make peace with the rebels and we'll give you the money for the Maine and all the soldiers, but we're keeping Cuba. And we're not giving them independence. We can't give them independence. We got to keep this colony of ours. And so April 11th, McKinley tried. He tried his best. April 11th, Congress declares war. And immediately after Congress declared war, Teddy Roosevelt activated his trap card. He's told all of those naval ships, hey, all those Spanish Navy fleets you found? Attack them immediately. Attack the Philippines immediately. May 1st, the forces launch a surprise attack on the Spanish ships in the Pacific Ocean and destroyed the entire Spanish fleet in the Pacific Ocean in 7 hours. Less than a day of work. And this is the moment other countries sit up and take notice and go, oh, okay. America's got something. They're not nothing. So Teddy Roosevelt basically immediately quits the Navy. He gets his way. They kind of find out about his secret illegal orders, but his plan worked, so they couldn't like dishonorably discharge him. So we don't know the exact details, but he ends up leaving the Navy, and he forms up a volunteer corps of Rough Riders, and it's his buddies from college and his buddies from like big game hunting, and he buys them all guns, horses, uniforms, kind of. And they roll on into Cuba. They fight a famous charge on San Juan Hill and become big war celebrities, even though that's like really the only battle they fought in. They didn't fight much. They didn't really contribute much to the actual victory of Cuba under this war. But like he got famous, like famous enough to run for president in the very near future. And Secretary of State John Hay ended up calling this a splendid little war. We defeated the entire Pacific Fleet of the Spanish Navy in 7 hours. And we defeated the Spanish Navy in the Atlantic Ocean in less than 2 months. Now, 2,500 Americans died, but only 400 were killed in battle. 2,100 were killed of disease or food poisoning. We weren't very good at canning food yet. We've gotten much better. So, so people in America flip out. We just kicked the Spanish Empire's teeth in. This is like the aging champ in a UFC fight going up against this up and comer, and even Vegas odds are on the champ. Like experience, age, totally going to beat out this new kid. And that fight is kind of hyped up a little bit, and then it comes time for the fight, and the new kid just pops out, punches the dude in the face once, dude falls over, fight's over. And it's like, oh snap. This kid's got some moxie. So we got the Treaty of Paris. Spain loses this war, America wins this war, we all go to Paris to sign the peace treaty. And Spain recognizes Cuba's independence. Cuba becomes an independent nation. And they give the U.S. the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Now we got to throw some cash at them to technically buy it from them. But we have territories. We have an empire. Now, this treaty barely passes the Senate. Because remember, the president can negotiate the treaty, but the Senate has to ratify it. It has to hold a vote, and 2/3 of the senators need to say yes, and they barely got it, barely. There were a lot of anti-imperialist sentiment out there, but Teddy Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay and McKinley, they're able to kind of get this through, right? And so we have a problem in the Philippines, the problem of the Philippines, and this ends up being a problem for us a few other times in our history, and you'd think we'd learn the lesson. But this is the first time we kind of come across this problem. In the Philippines, we had fought our troops had fought alongside Filipino rebels, and they were like, hey, we're going to kick the Spanish out. We're going to have control over our country again. Yes, and the Americans are here to help us. The Americans, the ones that fought a rebellion and became an independent country, and they're a democracy, and they talk about freedom and democracy and getting rid of colonial rulers. They're going to help us out. Well, after the war, the Filipinos expected us to let them be independent. We were helping them become independent of Spain. We weren't there to conquer them. We were there to help them become independent of Spain. But after the war, we're like, no, we're keeping it. And so the rebel leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, I probably pronounced that wrong, sorry. He was sort of the rebel leader that helped us fight against Spain when it becomes clear that we're not going to give up power in the Philippines. He basically declares war against us. And at first, America ignores them, 1899. But we can't ignore the fact that they are at war with us. The rebels try and fight off the American troops, try and get the Americans out of the Philippines. And this war lasts for 3 years. The Spanish-American War lasted 2 months. Half of it lasted 7 hours. The war in the Philippines lasts 3 years. 4,000 Americans dead, over 200,000 Filipinos dead. The vast majority of them civilians. And we do not give them their independence until 1946, after World War II. So we see some American troops lining up to fire, and then we also see American troops torturing a Filipino person to try and get information from them. So, awesome. Awesome. And similar things are going to happen in Korea and Vietnam and like Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, we keep doing this, right? You'd think we'd figure it out, but not yet. Not yet. So, Congress trying to decide what are we going to do with Cuba, right? I mean, this is what that was what happened with the Philippines. What do we do with Cuba? Cuba gets to stay independent. Remember, the whole reason we stepped into this fight is to help Cuba gain its independence. We can't just keep it. So we have the Teller Amendment, which is basically an attachment to that, Cuban independence resolution that we passed, saying we recognize Cuba as an independent nation. We passed an amendment to it saying we will not annex Cuba. We will not take over Cuba. So we didn't. But we did sort of, kind of, definitely set up their government and made sure they knew who was in charge. So we set up a military dictatorship in Cuba loyal to us. And the Cubans saw through that immediately. So they start to draft up their own constitution that says America doesn't get anything to do with us. We're going to do things ourselves. And we still had American troops there to try and help after the war. And the Cubans at this point are like, okay, you can leave now. You're trying to set up a military dictatorship that's loyal to you and not to the people of Cuba. You need to leave. And the Americans were like, fine, we'll leave. If, and only if, you let us have a naval base on your island and intervene in the country when necessary. So Cuba's independent now, but America has a lot of control there. And we still have that naval base in Cuba in 2020. It's called Guantanamo Bay. You might have heard of it. Now, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Still is today. You can see it down on the map over there. Not quite as close to Florida as Cuba is. But there's Puerto Rico. And there was a brief military government transition before it just sort of became a part of the U.S. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Anyone born in Puerto Rico is a U.S. citizen. People living in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens. If you want to travel to Puerto Rico, you don't need a passport because you're just going to America. You can just get on a plane and go to Puerto Rico. They're not a state, so in the presidential election coming up, they don't get to vote in it. But they have to, pay taxes. What was that taxation and representation thing? I could have sworn we had something in American history that had something about taxation and probably not important. So Puerto Rico still a U.S. colony. Now Hawaii had nothing to do with the Spanish-American War, but this is about when we acquired Hawaii. And the leader of Hawaii, now Hawaii had been open to European and Asian sort of not settlers and colonizers, because the native Hawaiians still kind of controlled the island, but you could move there, you could set up a home there, you could set up a business there, you could go there. It was open. And the U.S. kept trying to put more and more and more control over the island, and Queen Liliuokalani was not having it. She was not a fan of this idea, so she worked really hard to try and keep Hawaii independent. Well, into this story steps Sanford Dole. You ever buy a pineapple or a banana with that Dole sticker on it? That's Sanford Dole. And he wants to grow pineapples in Hawaii, which are not native to Hawaii. And he wants to grow bananas in Hawaii, which are not native to Hawaii. And he doesn't want to have to pay Queen Liliuokalani all these taxes that she wants him to pay. So he tries to negotiate, he tries to figure something out, but she is resolute that her country is going to follow its country's laws and protect her country's people. And Sanford Dole doesn't want that. He wants a banana republic. He wants a government that is subservient to him, that will let him pay the native people very little money, let them pay the government very little money, and he gets to keep all the money himself. So she's not budging. So, the U.S. has interests in Hawaii. They have, it's a good refueling station for its naval ships, so a ton of naval ships come through Hawaii all the time. And there happens to be a group of Marines in Hawaii at the time, and Sanford Dole basically goes up to them and says, hey, would you like to help me remove this queen from power so I can take over this country? Now, Sanford Dole was not a general. He was not a member of the military at all. He had zero authority to be ordering these Marines around. And the Marines just did it anyway, because probably money. And so they have this revolution where these Marines roll in, take over the capital, and kick Queen Liliuokalani out of power and install Sanford Dole in as the governor. And a few years later, Congress officially annexes Hawaii with a treaty that wasn't actually correctly done through the legal system of the U.S. So, technically, Hawaii has an argument that it shouldn't belong to the U.S. and should still be an independent country, but, that's never going to happen. So, just because something is one way legally doesn't mean it's that way for real. There's a fantastic book about that whole thing called Unfamiliar Fishes by Sarah Vowell. Highly recommend checking that book out. So what about China? Well, what about it? It had nothing to do with the Spanish-American War. It's not an island in the Pacific. It's not, but the U.S. wants in on China. The problem with China is that, for the most part, China has closed off its doors to basically anybody else. China has no real reason to let anybody into the country. And England, in particular, is super mad about this. England wants to get into China and, sell them stuff. And John Hay, our splendid little war Secretary of State, he's getting kind of worried that if the European powers sort of force their way into China, like they've forced their way into a lot of other places, they will sort of claim that as part of their empires, and then the U.S. won't be able to buy and sell stuff from China. So he proposes this open door policy. That's a thing that might show up on the STAR test. The open door policy is basically saying, hey, if you guys sort of take over China, if you just happen to take over China, let's go ahead and open it up to the whole world so everyone can buy and sell from China. And they basically agreed to that. So this is a cartogram. It is a map that is adjusted to fit a statistic. And so every little block on there is, how many people? $6,000? No, that's not it. Anyway, sorry, it's too small to see. But every block represents the same number of people. So India, in blue, is not really that big, but it has that many people. Canada, the little yellow line right above the U.S., much bigger than that, but that's how many people lived there, right? So China, huge amount of people. India is already closed off. It's part of the British Empire. India is closed off to us as a market, but China still exists as a market. And so the Boxer Rebellion happens in China. This is what kind of sets things off. There's these traditional Chinese people that are martial artists. That's why they got the name Boxers. They didn't give themselves the name Boxers. They got called Boxers. And they didn't like the fact that all these foreign countries were coming in. They were pushing their religion. They were pushing their culture. They were pushing opium. Did I forget to mention that the main thing England wanted to sell? in China was opium, the drug, like the opioid epidemic in America, that opium, that's the thing England wanted to sell in China. And they were growing it in Afghanistan, which has problems with terrorism because of all the opium that's grown there today. And everything that's wrong with the world was caused by the British Empire, wasn't it? That's an exaggeration, but like, not by much. So these boxers, the righteous and harmonious fists, now that's the English translation of the actual Chinese name, they start a rebellion. So they basically murder 300 foreigners and Christian Chinese converts. They believe that they had betrayed China by converting to this European religion. And part of their training was doing certain styles of martial arts trainings that they thought would make them bulletproof. It did not. So the rebellion doesn't last very long. And the European powers in China are able to put it down pretty quickly, and they use it as an excuse to grab more power over the Chinese government. And this is where Secretary of State John Hay gets really worried, right? Because he thought that the U.S. was going to lose influence in China, and these other European powers were going to kick the U.S. out of the Chinese market. So he sends out a second series of open door statements saying, we really need open trade in China, and the U.S. is very interested in that. Well, we had just kicked the Spanish Armada's teeth in, so the European countries were at least a little interested in seeing what we had to say about it. And we'll be talking more about the Boxer Rebellion next week. So, what did it matter? What was gained and what was lost? Why is the Spanish American important in U.S. history? And what we gained an empire. We gained new territory. We were able to get natural resources out of the Philippines, and Hawaii and these other places. And we got a new market for our goods. Once we annexed Hawaii, Hawaii could only buy and sell to us. Same with the Philippines, same with Puerto Rico, right? And we get this reputation in war. Like, Europe has to sit up and take notice. They have to sit up and take notice that the U.S., we're not the superpower yet. Not like we are today. But we're somebody that has to be considered. If you're going to make a move in the Americas, you're going to need to understand how the U.S. can influence that move you want to take. Before, it didn't matter. Before, the U.S. Army and military was a joke. Like, yeah, they beat the British, but that's because the British just decided they didn't want to spend any more money on that war. Like, the U.S. Army was no real threat to the European empires at the time. Until now. Now, the U.S. wasn't going to be able to roll in and just take over an empire from somebody, but like, if you weren't careful and if you let them get the first shot in, you might be in trouble. Like, and that's what happened to Spain. And that's what we gained. But what did we lose? There's always a trade-off, right? There's always a consequence. And what the first big loss is Washington's vision of America. We are no longer the country that stays out of foreign entanglements, that stays out of alliances, that stays out of other countries' businesses. We are part of the world, and we are of the world, and we are going to have an effect on the world. We are going to be sitting at the big boy table with the other big boy countries. And on a more literal level, we lost thousands of American lives over the course of these wars. And in just one example, the Filipino sort of revolution against us, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed by us, by America. Most of them civilians. So when we talk about these big things that happen, yes, big things happen, but there are losses too. So have a good day. We'll talk soon.